Hi everyone, we just announced our Series A led by Khosla Ventures, and I'm excited to talk to Jon from Khosla today, who agreed to share some insights on why Khosla decided to invest in Loft. Jon, thanks for joining me for this quick session.
Glad to be here.
You're a partner at Khosla Ventures today, but you're also a former founder and an engineer with deep expertise in the container space. Before we dive into why you decided to invest in Loft, would you mind sharing a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I come mostly from the technical and engineering side. Have done a lot of infra and machine learning. So I started my career. I was one of the OGs back at Palantir when it was a lot smaller, and afterwards I started a company. It was a problem I saw at Palantir doing DevOps, and Peter Thiel funded that company. We did okay and ended up getting acquired by Docker. So I got to see the whole container wave happen. Ended up running a few teams at Docker and leading the enterprise team. And then after Docker, that's where I went into machine learning at another small company called Opendoor, which also IPO'd, and then ended up at Facebook again doing machine learning. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the overview. When you first read my blurb that I sent over, what made you want to learn more and take the meeting with me?
Yeah, so that's actually kind of funny. I remember when I read the blurb, it was Jon over at Skydeck that introduced us, and my initial reaction was like, okay, this is like another container company that's like aeons late to the game, and like, what is this like Kubernetes virtualization? This is probably not worth my time. But Jon really thinks it's interesting, and I clicked around and I was like, oh, neat. The open source project actually is like getting some kind of steam. So I will go chat with Lukas and just get an understanding of what this thing is, and maybe I'll learn something interesting. And turns out I'd learned something very interesting, um, which was essentially like, if you think about virtualization and Kubernetes virtualization, every single time someone figures out a next level of virtualization, there's a gigantic business unit or company that is built and a ton of value is created. And vCluster has figured out exactly that, which is what really caught my eye afterwards.
Awesome. Thanks for that insight. And yeah, at this point, shout out to Jon from Skydeck for being so enthusiastic about us to make you have another look. Yeah, so after we had that first call together, I remember how quickly you were to introduce me to some other folks on the Khosla team, including Brian and Sven. I remember like they introduced to Brian, that was like a minute or so after we actually wrapped up the call. Is Khosla always that quick?
I mean, so we try to be really fast, right? Usually it's not minutes, but we try to be fast. Because like as a founder, I think even if we're going to say no, like this is a fundraising is kind of a nerve-wracking process, and you don't want to keep someone hanging. And you want to at least get the founder an answer they can get back to work, right? We don't want to burn your time. So like we owe it to founders to be as quick as we can. Um, I think like part of this being so quick too was like Brian was one of the four original VPs of product that built VMware. And regardless of if we did this or not, I thought you would enjoy that discussion and he would be helpful. And also, like, when you talk about things that are highly technical, like networking and container virtualization or Kubernetes, sorry, case virtualization, I think there's like a number of people that are just like, ooh, that looks shiny. I want to learn more. And like Sven and Brian are definitely those type of people. So they would find it fun regardless.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely enjoyed the conversation with Brian. There was definitely a certain level of like just being able to go quite a bit deeper. And I remember it was like I think he took the call at like 6 or 7 p.m. same day after you introduced us. So I guess he was very curious to actually learn more what we're up to.
Yeah, I think he had a similar reaction to me, which was like, huh, like another container company that's super late. And then like I was like, no, 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 it's virtualization. Like take one look. And he reads the deck and he's like, oh, that actually looks really interesting.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think Sven and you obviously sponsored the deal, and then you invited me to this kind of pitch meeting in your offices in that beautiful office in Menlo Park with the very distinct coloring, and
It was
it was.
completely, that whole office is architected by Vinod. Vinod is like
I can
actually
see.
hobby is architecture.
Got it, got it. Yeah, it's very impressive when you first walk in and you're like, oh wow, this is purple.
That is also Vidot's favorite color.
Yeah, I would have bet. Yeah, it was obviously, amazing meeting the Khosla team in person, and there was a lot of energy in that room. Like everybody had question, I had ideas, like including Vinod. Everybody got into the discussion. That was really great to see, and everybody was like, okay, where can this journey kind of take us, right? Of virtualizing Kubernetes. That was very inspiring to have that conversation. What do you think was it about the idea of virtualizing Kubernetes that got everyone so fired up in that room?
There's a couple things. I think like the first one is that you had the right people in the room. Like all of the people in the room are ex-founders, actually ex-DevTools or technical founders, right? Um, One of them, Nikita, is actually a current founder in DevTools, Neon. Uh, and every single one of us like interesting technology and work in highly infrastructure or have worked in highly infrastructure oriented spaces. So I think I told you this, but like in my mind, it's kind of like, okay, where does this fix the problems that I ran into at Docker? This is like a second shot at goal. Vinod was thinking about like how this applied back to Sun Microsystems back in the day, right? So like we're all kind of reliving parts of what we did in the past when we're talking to you. And then the other part of this is like you have a really engaging and interesting founder, which honestly, to your credit, you had some really solid answers that created great discussions for us. And one of the things that was most exciting was like, we've been talking about this inside the firm for a long time, but there's been a promise that companies keep making, which is essentially like, I don't want to be locked in to clouds anymore. And I want this like portability story. And Docker was supposed to solve that. And like VMware was supposed to solve that. And no one has actually ever solved that. But then like you look at K8s virtualization and you look at vCluster, and like, yes, it's not going to solve the data portability side of the house, but like you can actually solve the compute portability side of the house for the first time, which is half of the problem. And then you have Nikita over on the side that's like, but Neon can solve the other side. So like, yes, this is amazing, right? So like when you get that kind of thinking and that kind of engagement in the room, then yeah, you get a really amazing discussion.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And yeah, thank you so much for the compliment also. Appreciate that. Yeah, that flatters me a lot.
Well, I mean, like we
Um,
love you, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be investing.
Yeah, no, it was great. I think that I walked out of there and I was like, yeah, there's some conviction here at this firm about what we're doing, and there's definitely some chemistry. Khosla invested obviously in a whole bunch of engineering focused company before us. KB was the first investor in OpenAI and GitLab, and you also backed companies like HackerRank, Kaggle. I think you were involved in Stripe. Obviously, you mentioned Nikita with Neon. What makes you and the rest of the Khosla team so bullish on investing in developer kind of focused ventures?
Yeah, I'd actually say like in the companies you mentioned, some of them are more like when we invested, we consider them less developer oriented, more just like really cool technology oriented ones. And then some of them are developer oriented ones. So I'll split those into two. But like for the developer oriented ones, part of it is at least everybody in the room in that pitch that you met, we're all engineers, right? So like we love seeing things that kind of feel like magic to us for our own problems. And that makes us excited. So solving developer problems is interesting. Um, the other part here too is if you look at where value creation is, Mark Andreessen said this a long time ago, but like software is eating the world, right? And software engineers create tons and tons of value. And being able to make them more efficient, make their lives better, make their work easier, helps unlock a ton of value creation. If you look at Stripe's whole pitch, like or whole vision, they basically want to lift the GDP of the internet. And the way you lift the GDP of the internet for Stripe is like, let's make the developers' lives easier so that they can do that. So you're actually creating a ton of value for the world by helping devs. And like, yes, it's not like the first order impact, maybe it's the second order impact, but it's still a huge impact.
That makes a ton of sense. Do you have a particular thesis around investing in open source rooted companies?
I don't think like personally, some of the other investors at KV might have a different thought here, but personally, I don't have like a specific thesis for open source, but I have a couple guidelines I look at when there's an open source company that helps me think about the framing of the company itself and the opportunity. And Loft actually, I guess unsurprisingly, given we're having this conversation, fit a lot of them. But the first part is the value of the community to that particular industry or that particular business. So one of the major values open source actually gets you is giving you the ability to build a very valuable community that actually has your users in it that becomes very powerful. And the second thing I look for, which is tied to community, is actually open source, or the product being open source, helping the product experience itself, right? And this is actually something that is very useful in things like DevTools, because in DevTools, a lot of times what you actually run into is a developer trying to actually get something done, or a DevOps person trying to get something done. And if you have to go through a sign-up flow or a process in the product and you get stuck, a lot of cases they can unblock themselves by looking at the source code and actually unstucking themselves. And if you can't do that, they're just going to code the solution themselves or move on themselves, right? So like the product itself actually can be better by being open source, which is very common in DevTools, and Loft fits both of those. And the third thing I look for is actually like, is this a type of industry or a type of product space where you can actually build a defensible business or a valuable business in open source? And like, I'll pick on one area that it's very challenging to build a defensible business in open source that fits the first two things that I mentioned, which is continuous integration, right? And a lot of companies have tried, but the big issue with continuous integration is it's too close to the dev workflow, where developers are tempted to do it all themselves, and it's not hard enough, or like it's it is solvable by most engineers if they spend enough time on it, and attractive to solve. So you end up running into this issue where like people aren't willing to value the software quite as much, right? But for something like Loft, or for like Kubernetes management or cluster virtualization, that is one area that everyone knows is difficult, is kind of a pain, and no one really, really wants to be fighting Kubernetes all the time, right? And no one really, really wants to be dealing with cluster management and dealing with cluster scaling. So these are areas that very much there is a willingness to pay and doesn't run into that issue.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, I think the transparency in the code, as you mentioned, really being able to also find out, hey, you know, where do I get stuck? How can I also give feedback and improve this thing? I think that's something we've definitely seen a ton with our product. You know, people get started and then they're like, hey, this doesn't run on this version of ARM. And, you know immediately, because everybody knows where to put a ticket, right? Like there's GitHub issues, you open it and it's immediately clear what to do. Versus some of the products I signed up before, it's not even clear, like, where's the feedback button, right?
And for vCluster too, like I think that first point on community, vCluster, if you look at the open source project, it hasn't dominated yet, but it's well on its way to becoming a standard. And like, I think something like that needs an open source community to really become a standard and be tip of the tongue for engineers and DevOps people and platform engineers when they actually want to do something. Because if you don't have that open source community, like, where does it go, right? Like, where does engineers hang out? I mean, you're not really going to be able to build a standard for engineering on a subreddit. So like, where does that platform, or where does that community actually end up?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Yeah, I think for us, people just in the Slack community discussing things, but also, GitHub issues, open a pull request really quickly.
Exactly.
All of that community in action is super, super valuable.
Yeah, in the open source community, your customers build relationships inside of the pull request. It's actually quite amazing.
Yeah, for sure. It's actually funny that you mentioned that. I can remember meeting people for the first time in person that I've only known the GitHub handle of initially, right? Because like initially that's how it starts.
Yep. That happened to me at Docker.
Yeah, obviously, GitLab also was one of the, investments that Khosla made, and it's a very, very kind of iconic commercial open source company. And I think you backed it from the seed round on. I personally love the GitLab story. I get inspired a lot of by that story and what GitLab does and how it runs their operations. Including building a fully distributed, like truly remote only company. There's obviously been a shift, to remote work, with the pandemic. We're all aware of that. But we've also seen all the headlines of back to office mandates and all of that stuff come in. What is your take on building a true remote culture and a company that may not even have an office?
Yeah. So I think one answer is like GitLab clearly made it work, so it's possible, right? I think there's basically two modes. One is that you have remote in your DNA, and that's how you work. The second mode is that you are in office, or like you're hybrid, but everybody has to be in office for some periods of time. So you're basically getting that in office culture, and that works. The thing that doesn't work is like part of the company is remote and part of the company is not. And the reason being is if you think about company culture ends up being what you incentivize people to do through how you reward them and how you punish them. Although usually like carrot works better than the stick, right? And the issue with these hybrid companies is that you have this like class of people that just get more face time with people in leadership or others. And that gives them the ability to influence more and also gives them an unfair advantage. And like, it's really, really hard for you not to give them an unfair advantage when things are in person. So what ends up happening is that that one side of your company that is remote ends up atrophying, ends up not getting promotion opportunities or whatnot, right? And like that causes a rift in the culture and causes issues. Um, so like if you haven't really gone all in on the remote and built your company from a remote first culture, that causes a lot of problems. The other thing too is just like the way a fully remote company operates is just a little bit different. And you kind of have to tune your company and get them to actually work that way. You mentioned GitLab, but like Sid wrote an operating manual on how to actually run a remote company, and it's fantastic. A lot of it is like, okay, there's less meetings and discussions, and a lot more of that is happening in writing so everyone can see it. So like you can tell me exactly what you're thinking. I can be asleep on the other side of the world. I can read that, and I'm on the same playing field as everybody else the moment I read that, right? And it requires a different type of person that is much better at writing, or at least training people to be much more communicative in text versus, or like long form text versus like what me and you're doing right now and just talking, right? But if you build in that DNA from the beginning and you hire people that are good at working in a mode like that, you can be very successful.
That makes a ton of sense. I think, as a open source rooted company, I think we're, and obviously GitLab the same way, right, with their open core model. We're a little bit, in a prime position to actually make that happen because, open source inherently is kind of like distributed and remote first and asynchronous and written down, right? Like apart from maybe, community calls or something like that once a week, most of the open source work is done asynchronously and is done in a written communication style, even if it's just a quick Slack back and forth, right? In some occasions.
I'd actually say it's kind of interesting. Like one of these really big benefits you have being an open source project is that you can hire from the community, and you kind of already know the quality of the people you're hiring because they like submit PRs to your project, right? To your code base. So you kind of know what the quality is, and their hiring can be fantastic. But then like that comes with the double-edged sword of if you're an in-office culture, then you have all those issues that I just mentioned. And we ran into this at Docker is like, yes, we got fantastic people from the community, but then like those people had a hard time working half in office, half not, and like not being in office. And then you started having like these weird solves. It's like, oh, let's have an in-office team in France, and like let's have an in-office team in San Francisco. And then it's like, okay, well, that doesn't really work because time zones don't work out and whatnot. Or like you can completely split them, but then you have the teams not talking. You have a bunch of other issues. But if you're fully remote like GitLab, you actually get the benefit of like, hey, or like Loft, we're like hiring from our open source community, right? But like at the same time, you don't have the issue of like, okay, now that we've hired from people all over the world, how do we actually like make that work? It's like, oh wait, we've already figured out how to make that work. We're fully remote.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of our best engineering hires are former contributors and then just keep working on the thing that they're excited about, very intrinsically as well, right? That's exciting. Or the hires that actually, discover us through the application and then dive into the code after the first interview, and then we see the first kind of comments and even ideally a PR pop up. That's always like a very positive. It's actually internally something that we track when folks apply, do they get involved?
I mean, it's great too because they're like they spent their free time on it, so like obviously they care about the mission. So there's so much that just is already pre-vetted and works and just aligns with you already from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Switching topic though, one thing that I'm kind of curious about, right now we talked a lot about vCluster, and that's the project we're mainly known for. But we also launched another open source project last year called DevPod. DevPod is this GitHub Codespaces, competitor. It's open source. It's a little bit less opinionated in terms of how you deploy it. It's client only, so it's got some very distinct, I think, competitive edges in terms of what it delivers compared to anything that's out there so far. And I know that VCs generally don't like to see this lack of focus. And how is that for you hearing about DevPod? Was that something that made you more excited about investing, or did it raise some questions?
I think it was it was mostly neutral, slight positive for me. And the way I thought about it was essentially like uh, for most of these companies, you need at least one, or you have one product that is the spearhead that really puts the company on the map and makes everything work. And for you guys and for Loft, that's vCluster, right? And like it's well on its way there. It's not quite there yet, but it's well on its way there. And if you can make vCluster be the standard for K8s virtualization, you have a very valuable company. Now, if you look at most of these dev tools or like DevOps companies, to make an extraordinarily valuable generational company, you usually can't rely on one product. You need some kind of platform. And the thing about DevPod that was really positive and interesting for me is the fact that you guys understood that. And that kind of showed that, okay, like we're not here to create unicorns. We're here to try to actually go make a generational company that is going to change the industry. And we have to aim a little bit higher than one product. Now, is it too early? Maybe, maybe not, right? Like, who knows? But it showed, and like you're able to articulate, you guys have a very clear vision on the kind of platform you want to deliver for the type of customer, which is platform engineers. You've made good headways into it. And honestly, like after seeing how you guys handled vCluster, we were just kind of like, I mean, all of us were kind of like, we trust you guys to actually just do a good job and have good taste in building a great product in DevPod.
Awesome. That's good to hear. Yeah, it was definitely kind of seizing the opportunity for us. Obviously vCluster is getting very popular, and is a lot of work still. Obviously, there's so many things to do. But we saw that pain of that kind of lack that was out there, right? There was just like this area of opportunity, and we knew it would fit in like to the overall story, given that it's kind of the same persona, right? The platform engineers they care a lot about handing out Kubernetes to the engineers. That is a really big hair on fire problem today. How to set up and architect your Kubernetes in a more efficient way. Initially, it was all about how to stand up and operate a cluster, and then now you have like hundreds or even thousands of clusters, right? And you're like, oh boy, this is getting out of hand, right? And it's obviously a hair and fire problem, but a lot of people are also looking at this consistent dev environment and developer productivity, and it kind of ties very nicely into handing out clusters, handing out dev environments. So we saw that opportunity, and just jumped on it, I guess.
To your guys' credit, we've talked to a ton of companies that are basically doing replicable dev environments. And I think the approach of going after the platform team, solving their bigger problem or core problem first, which is like not the engineer's problem. They care more about DevPod, but the platform team's problem cares a lot more about Kubernetes. solving their problem first and using that as a wedge into the dev problem. Because like at the end of the day, the platform engineering team or the DevOps team is the one that kind of spins up and gives the developers their environments, is a great way to start building out that platform for engineers. And if you look at other successful companies that are kind of inside of your dev tooling space, like you have HashiCorp, you have GitLab, they all end up being a platform at some point in time, right? And there's one product that spearheads it, and other ones are built around it. So you guys are very much following that playbook.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. I think we're starting with two of these building blocks right now. vCluster kind of spearheading things and then kind of planting the seed for the next one. But yeah, as you mentioned, there may be more building blocks to come in the future, right?
But to be clear, like if you guys just had vCluster, we still would have invested. That's just the cherry on top, right? It's the option call. Kind of like, if Google just had search, I would still love that company. But now that they have Gmail, I love that company even more.
Yeah, I definitely love the Waymos, driving around here in SF. I took them quite a few times, so hopefully they'll build that out even more.
I love the predictability of Waymo.
All right, Jon, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate you hopping on and sharing all these insights. And I'm even more excited to be partnering with you. You obviously joined our board now. Very excited to be working with you and Khosla Ventures as a whole. Obviously, I think by now I've met like 8 more people from Khosla since you guys invested, and that's super exciting. I'm just so pumped, and I see the value on all kinds of ends. Whether it's hiring, whether it's like go-to-market strategy. It seems like you always have the right kind of expert to connect me to, which is amazing. So extending that thank you to the rest of the Khosla team at this point as well. And I hope for the rest of the community and everybody kind of listening in, this was helpful, and you got to know our Series A lead investor a little bit here, which hopefully gets everybody excited. And if you are as fired up as Jon and the Khosla team are about vCluster, but you haven't played with it, head to vcluster.com to get started. And definitely join us on Slack. You'll find us at slack.vcluster.com. And obviously, if you're interested in DevPod, you'll also find DevPod on GitHub. Get in touch with the community, and I'll see you around. Thank you, Jon.
Yeah, thank you guys.